So what I'm doing is I'm publishing this API specification to Exchange. It's going to prompt me, do I want to move into the implementation portion? I'm going to say yes. And then that's going to do all of my scaffolding for this particular API. And then we can talk about the configuration panel, which is going to be super exciting. So we'll wait for this to publish. There we go. Everything's published. It's going to ask me, do I want to implement this? I'm going to say yes. I'm going to give this a name. I'll just say account creation demo 215. Have me select my directory here. And here we can see that we're scaffolding this API. So here I can come in, I can go to my source main Mule, open up my XML here. And I'm going to open up the split view so I can take a look at the Canvas UI as well. And perfect. Looks like everything's good. It's going to take the canvas just a second to render here. There we go. Looks like it rendered pretty fast. So here we can see we have our main. This has our listener. We have a router here. And then we have sort of just a flow here for the actual post request. So let's start working with it. One of the most exciting things that we're coming out with as part of this February release is, like I mentioned earlier, the configuration panel. And this allows users who are working within the canvas. Before, we offered things like the ability to add different components, or you could click on a component and see it highlighted in the XML, but you still had to do a lot of that configuration within the XML. It was tedious, especially folks who are familiar with sort of the studio experience. They want that UI. They want to be able to configure things from within the canvas view. And so that's what we're starting to offer as part of February. So if I click on my listener here, this is what we call the configuration panel. And so this is just a little panel that opens up along the right-hand side of a user's screen that allows them to do a lot of their configurations for the components, similar to like they would maybe in Studio. And what we're doing is we're rendering a lot of the same metadata fields that Studio renders. So folks who maybe are coming over or trying ACB, they should see many of the same fields that they're already used to working with, which is great. You can see that we have a few different tabs here. I know listener is not super exciting. General just has the path. But we do have advanced. So you can see if I click over here, we can work with things like our allowed methods. I can set my streaming mode. We have MIME types. I can add parameters if I wanted to, or I can remove them. So this is all brand new coming as part of the February release. And this is for just about every component out there. So here, what we can do, I can actually sort of scroll this over so we can see what this would look like. First things first, we can change our display name. So I can just say like API listener, click check mark. Notice how that updates here. It should also update in the code. So if I click on this, we can see our doc name is API listener. I can do things like configure my allowed methods. So I'll just set that to post. Path, if we wanted to change this, I can do so as well. So I can just come here and just say like something like that maybe. I can test my connection. So here it's pulling in my connection, and we'll talk about connections here in a second. But I can actually click on that play button, and similar to working within the code and using the test connection button here, it's going to do something similar by clicking on the play button. It's going to verify that connection and let you know if it's valid or not. So that's the configuration panel. We're going to be working with it as we go through building out our flow here. Essentially, the long-term goal that we're going to be doing is, we saw that account creation API, users can provide information about a particular account. We're going to go ahead and do that within Salesforce and within NetSuite, and just take a look at how that configuration panel looks along the way as we build out that flow. So I'm going to come to my flow list here, and let's just go right to my post. And I don't really want this logger, so I'm going to get rid of it. And we can go ahead and add our components like normal. So I can click on this play button. I can add in a core processor, and I want to set my payload to a variable. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to say set variable. And if we open that up, I can give this a value. And one thing you might notice is expression mode. So if folks want to use data weave or expressions and they want that to be treated as such at the runtime, they can toggle the expression mode on using the FX icon here in the upper right-hand corner above the field. So I can toggle that on. You'll notice that we now visually denote that we are in expression mode. So I could just set this to something like payload. And you'll notice how that's automatically updating my XML at the same time. Additionally, I need to give this a variable name, so I can do so as well. So I can just say variable1, and everything's good there. That's now reflected in my XML. And for folks who want to make changes in the XML, that's okay too. Watch this. If I come over here, I can just say something like request payload, and you'll see that it's automatically updating within my UI as well. So now let's add in the next step here. Let's go ahead and start working with some transformations. Now, I've already done the transformations between sort of my payload and Salesforce. So I've saved them as a snippet file. So I'm just going to go ahead and insert those. So I have payload to Salesforce transformation. And now let's add in our Salesforce component. So I'll come here, go to my connectors, come to Salesforce, click on create, and it's going to automatically import that connector, add everything to the POM file. I'm going to say yes. And we'll probably get some errors here because we haven't done anything related to configuration. So let's talk about that. I'm going to open up my Salesforce here, and you'll notice that we don't have any data here because we haven't defined any of our connections to our Salesforce instance. So I'm going to close that out and add those in sort of into my flow here. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm just going to add in my configuration properties. And let's add in my Salesforce config. And I need to import my config.yaml. Put that in my resources folder. Now, if I hover over, yep, looks like things are good there. And just for fun, I'm going to add in this other Salesforce config. This one. There we go. And we'll just set this to Salesforce, config 2. And I'll explain why I'm doing this here in a second. So let's save. Okay. If I open up my Salesforce component now, and I click on the drop-down list, now you'll see that I have options to choose a connection. So like I was mentioning before, you'll define your connections in your XML, but then those will be reflected here as part of your flow experience. So as you're editing your component, if you're working with multiple connections, you can seamlessly sort of transition between those as part of the drop-down list. And then similarly, you can test them to make sure that they're valid. So from here, my first one is going to be the only one that will really work. So because that's where I have my credentials defined, I'm going to select the first connection, and you can see that we're now gathering operations for my configuration here. And what we're doing is we're pulling in the metadata, the actual objects that I'm able to edit or create as part of this Salesforce operation. So now if I come down here and I go to my type, you'll see that we've pulled in everything from our Salesforce instance, all of those different objects. And these are the same ones that you should see in Studio if you're familiar with that. And we know this list is super long, especially for systems like Salesforce or NetSuite. You have so many objects that you can work with. So it's really easy to search. You can actually just search for a keyword. I can just type in account, and you'll see that it brings up all my objects related to that particular keyword. So I'll select account from the drop-down menu. That's set. And should be good to go there. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that extra configuration just so we don't have any problems here. And the other thing I wanted to show, how are we looking at time? We're looking good. Okay, let's do it. You'll see this refresh button, and that's going to manually pull in any metadata. So you'll notice I'll go ahead and just add in a different component here. So let's just go connectors, Salesforce. We can go to, let's say, Upsert. We're going to cache those metadata values that we pulled in as part of that connection process. So you'll notice if I come in here and I choose my Salesforce config, my object types are already pulled in. I didn't have to re-wait for those to get pulled because those are being cached. So that just speeds up the development process, makes it a little less annoying. So if you're inserting multiple Salesforce operations or NetSuite operations or whatever systems that you're using, you don't have to wait for that metadata refresh to happen every single time. But let's say you add in a custom object. Let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to close this and delete my upsert here. And we can just say, let's look for something called like demo object. Yeah, we don't have anything like that right now. So let's go ahead and add it. Great. From here, we can see our demo object was created. So now let's go back to VS Code. And we can refresh that metadata. See that we're refreshing our options. Looks like that's done. Now if I look for demo object, you can now see that we're able to edit or work with that new object that we created. So if you ever create something new, you need to refresh those values within your ACB instance. That's how you do it. Click this manual refresh button right there. We're not going to be working with that custom object, but I just want to show you how that process would work. Okay, let's keep the show on the road. What other cool stuff can I show here? Let's continue on. I'm actually going to pull in my NetSuite connector. We'll look for NetSuite. You'll notice that we're not finding anything locally, so let's go ahead and search in Exchange. Pull in the NetSuite connector here, and we want to add, NetSuite calls them customers, so I'm going to do that. Always. And we'll insert our transformation as well. So we're going to take that variable and transform it into a format readable by NetSuite. So HTTP payload to NetSuite transformation. Put that in there. And you'll notice we have an error. It's because we don't have a connection defined. So I'm actually going to close this, come up to the top here, and we'll insert our NetSuite connection. Format that a little better. Cool. Looks like we're pulling that in. So I can come here, choose my connection now. And you'll notice here, we're only showing NetSuite configurations. So that's another cool thing about this drop-down menu is we're not seeing our Salesforce connection. We're not seeing our HTTP listener connection. When you're configuring your actual components and you're selecting the connections from the drop-down list, you're only going to see connections that are relevant to that particular system. Now, we're not doing any sort of validation behind the scenes to say, hey, is this connection valid? Is it not valid? And that's what we're basing, what we show here on. It's simply, hey, is this a NetSuite connection? If so, that's what's coming in the drop-down list. So even if you have work to do as part of your configurations later on, you can still see those here, but you'll only see the configurations that are specific to the system that you're working with. So I'll set my NetSuite config. You'll notice that we're gathering the operations for our configuration. So once again, we're fetching those metadata objects from NetSuite, from our NetSuite instance, to see what things we're actually able to add. So in just a second here, looks like that finished. And like I mentioned, NetSuite calls them customers. So that's what we're going to add here. And we're good. So now, let's say let's say I got lost in my flow. My flow is super complex. I'm actually going to close this just so we have a little bit more UI space here. First off, the panel could be resized. That's just a small thing that I'll mention here. But anyways, let's say I get lost in my flow. I'm working with my XML here and I say, man, where is, let's pick our variable here. I want to see it. Well, I can actually right click on the variable and say show component in the Canvas UI. If I click on that, you'll notice it automatically redirects me to my variable component and opens up the configuration panel for me. Similarly, let's say let's go ahead and open up the variable again. I can move my flow off the screen. I'm lost. I've zoomed in or out too much. I don't know what to do. I can't get back. We have this icon here at the top right that will recenter on the node. So if I click that, you'll notice it automatically snaps me back to the component that I'm editing. And while we're waiting for this to debug, this is a great time to talk about, this is really the first iteration of the configuration panel. This is sort of our first step in offering configurations through the UI. So you might notice some fields, like if I come into Salesforce here and I go to advanced, this field for headers is grayed out. And if I hover over it, it's going to say, hey, this is read only. You can only configure this in the XML. And really what this is, it's an advanced object for us. And so we're adding support for some of these advanced objects as part of a future release. So think of this more as a phase one. You'll be able to configure a lot of different fields as part of, sort of this configuration panel out of the box with the February release. But you still might find some fields that are complex, which we'll be adding UI support for in the future. So in the meantime, those would still have to be configured in the XML. So things like advanced objects, or things like transformations, that's all going to come as part of a future release. So if you see those, it's totally normal. We just didn't want to cause confusion. We know a lot of folks are sort of used to working with Studio. So somebody might jump into ACB and say, hey, I don't know where the header tab is. We didn't want to hide it. So we're showing it as read-only, letting you know, hey, this is read-only. If you fill anything out in the XML, it'll show up here. You just can't edit it through the UI. And similarly, we trimmed down some of the tabs that appear in Studio. You'll notice that for my Salesforce Create, I really only have General, Advanced, and Notes. Some operations in Studio might have 5 or 6 different tabs. Well, we've consolidated all of those fields under just the Advanced tab here. So if you're saying, hey, where's this tab or where's that tab? Odds are those fields are just going to show up under Advanced, and it keeps the UI just a little bit cleaner. But looks like our application is deployed. So let's go ahead and send some API requests. I'm going to close that out. We're going to open up our REST client. Today, we're going to be using Thunder Client. I have my account creation, and we'll just say, give a company name here. I'll let you see the full request. I'm going to say something like 215 demo. And we'll keep everything else the same. Don't really need to change much there. So let's bounce back. Let's send our request, and hopefully everything is good to go. Let's see here. Looks like everything is processing, and we should see a 200 status OK if everything works as expected. Yep. You can now see that we have the 215 demo account up here. If I open it up, we should have all of the information that we sent as part of our request. So we have this phone number, we have the address, things like that. And it was created as an account. And similarly, if I come into NetSuite, perfect. Yeah, so we can see the phone number got created. We have our customer ID here. So everything works as expected with our flow that we were building. So that's a success. There's really not much else to show as part of that demo. I think the main thing I wanted to highlight was the configuration panel, being able to, set different fields, being able to interact with them and tweak different settings, have those be reflected within the XML code. Similarly, if you tweak anything in the XML, that shows up in the UI. So all of that is part of the configuration panel. So that's really the second thing I wanted to highlight as part of our February release. That's the config panel.